A sealed envelope lands on a War Department desk in 1943. Inside, proof that America's own generals may be working for the enemy. No one knew who sent it, or why the evidence looked so perfect. Was it truth, or the most dangerous lie ever crafted in the shadows of World War II? Fall 1943, Washington, D.C. The war in Europe has entered a critical phase. American troops are pushing through Italy, and plans for the largest invasion in history are already on secret maps inside locked offices. Every decision, every communication, carries the weight of the future. And then one morning, a sealed envelope arrives at the War Department. No return address, no explanation, just a faint smell of sea salt on the paper, as if it had traveled far before reaching this desk. Inside the envelope lies a single classified dossier marked "For Eyes of the Joint Chiefs Only." The contents would strike at the very heart of American command. The file contains photographs, reports, and what appear to be decoded German intelligence summaries. They accuse three of the Army's most trusted officers, Major General Raymond Mitchell, Colonel Frank Whitmore, and Lieutenant Colonel George Brennan, of secretly providing military intelligence to Berlin. The documents are precise, with dates, signatures, and even intercepted messages. Each page seems to tighten a noose around reputations built over decades. The evidence looks authentic, too authentic. Within hours, it reaches the desks of the highest-ranking intelligence officers in Washington. What they see is enough to cause alarm, but not enough to act on publicly. If these accusations were true, America's European strategy could be compromised. If they were false, someone had just fired an invisible bullet into the heart of Allied trust. Mitchell, Whitmore, and Brennan were not ordinary officers. Mitchell had overseen logistics for the North African campaign, known for his meticulous precision and calm leadership under pressure. Whitmore, a career intelligence liaison officer, was the quiet architect of several key Allied information networks. Brennan, a communications specialist, had built the secure channels connecting the Allied headquarters from London to Algiers. Their names appeared in countless classified memos, but always as men of integrity, loyalty, and experience. Now those same names appeared on a different list: suspected collaborators. The War Department faced an impossible dilemma. To announce an investigation would risk morale and public confidence at a time when unity was vital. To ignore the evidence could mean letting traitors sit at the planning table of Europe's liberation. So the decision was made: silent surveillance. No arrests, no warnings. Every word, every movement of the three men would be quietly watched. For them, the war had just entered a new battlefield, one fought in whispers, shadows, and half-seen faces. What unsettled the investigators most was the source of the information. The documents were routed through London before arriving in Washington, flagged by British intelligence as potentially important. According to the cover note, they had been discovered in a raid on a German consulate in Spain. That claim alone raised questions. Spain was neutral, and its intelligence web was notoriously complex. Many wartime discoveries were crafted by the very agencies they claimed to expose. Still, the material bore all the hallmarks of genuine German military documentation. The typography, the seals, even the faint aging of the paper. The initial analysis found nothing out of place. The handwriting on Mitchell's supposed confession matched his own. The communications logs matched the timing of Whitmore's reports. And Brennan's travel records lined up with alleged meetings in Switzerland. Everything pointed towards guilt, except the lingering sense that it was all too perfectly arranged. Behind closed doors, a quiet panic began to spread through corridors lined with polished floors and guarded doors. Senior officers who had once shared strategy briefings now avoided eye contact. Security clearances were reviewed. Files vanished overnight from desks where they had sat for months. A new layer of invisible pressure settled over Washington's war rooms. Even the most loyal officers began to glance over their shoulders. If 3 of their own could be accused, who would be next? Outside those offices, the world continued unaware. Newspapers spoke of progress in Italy, of heroism in the Pacific, of American factories running day and night. But inside the intelligence division, the war had taken on a new, insidious form, one fought not with bombs, but with belief. It was the kind of weapon Adolf Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, had long believed could win wars faster than armies. "If you control the truth," he had once said, "you control the future." Germany had already used propaganda to divide nations, distort facts, and create confusion behind enemy lines. But now, it seemed, that psychological war had reached the inner core of American command. As analysts reviewed the documents, a troubling question arose. How did this dossier make its way into Allied hands at precisely the moment when plans for a cross-channel invasion were under preparation? Was it intercepted intelligence or planted intelligence? The difference was everything. Someone, somewhere, was orchestrating an illusion so convincing that even the experts hesitated to challenge it. A whisper spread through the War Department halls. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted the Allies to doubt their own. For the 3 accused officers, the world began to change in ways they could not yet define. Mitchell noticed that his requests for updated reports were delayed. Whitmore's phone calls to London were suddenly rerouted. Brennan found a new clerk assigned to his office, polite, efficient, but always watching. None of them knew they were under investigation, but each could sense the shift in air, the quiet weight of suspicion pressing down on them. In war, trust was everything, and once that trust cracked, even slightly, it became a weapon in itself. By the end of the week, the file was sealed again and moved into a secure archive under a new classification label, Active Internal Investigation. Only 5 men knew of its existence. Outside that locked room, life continued as usual. But inside, the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were spreading quietly through the ranks. America's enemies might not have known it yet, but they had just launched one of the most effective psychological attacks of the war, an operation designed not to destroy armies, but to destroy certainty. The 3 accused officers seemed chosen with surgical precision, not by chance, not by random selection. Whoever had orchestrated this knew exactly where to strike. Each man occupied a post that, if compromised, could fracture the entire Allied command system. Major General Raymond Mitchell controlled the arteries of war: logistics, supply lines, transportation routes stretching from the American ports to the European front. Every ton of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every shipment of rations passed through his oversight. A single compromised message under his name could expose convoy routes or shipping schedules. The consequences were unthinkable. Colonel Frank Whitmore led an intelligence liaison team that connected American and British field units across North Africa and Southern Europe. He had access to reports, decryption updates, and high-level briefings. He was trusted with secrets too delicate to appear in print. In the wrong hands, even fragments of that information could map Allied intentions weeks ahead. And then there was Lieutenant Colonel George Brennan, the quiet architect behind the Allied communication grid. His systems ensured that every field order, every coded transmission reached its destination safely. If Brennan were truly leaking data, he could be opening invisible corridors straight into the enemy's command centers. Together,
These three men represented the backbone of the Allied operational network. To cast suspicion on them was to cast suspicion on the system itself. But there was something else, something deeper, that made them ideal targets. The German intelligence apparatus, guided by years of study, understood human history as well as human weakness. Each officer carried, somewhere in his past, a detail that could be reframed into suspicion.
For Mitchell, it was correspondence with a German academic before the war. The exchange had been scholarly, focused on logistics and industrial production methods, perfectly innocent. But in the right context, it looked like the beginning of contact. Whitmore's vulnerability was his ancestry. Distant relatives living in occupied France, people he had once sent money to before the invasion. A simple act of compassion could now be twisted into evidence of sympathy. Brennan's weak point was a professional one. In 1936, he had traveled to Berlin as part of a military delegation to observe European radio advancements. He had even attended a reception hosted by German officers, an event photographed and documented by newspapers. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, in the shadow of war, those same photographs resurfaced as proof of allegiance. None of these facts were secret. All were recorded in service files. Yet somehow, someone had pieced them together into a narrative that painted three patriots as potential traitors. It was more than coincidence. It was calculation. It was a blueprint for destruction drawn by minds that understood perception better than truth. The architects behind this deception knew that real spies were dangerous, but that accused spies were devastating. In Berlin, such manipulation had become an art form. Goebbels' propaganda ministry had refined the science of distortion. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had mastered the use of forged documents and counterfeit witnesses. Their reports were built on fragments of reality, carefully shaped until lies felt logical. Operation Zweifel, though unknown by name to Washington at this point, was one of many ongoing psychological offensives designed to erode Allied trust. Instead of sabotaging machinery or intercepting communications, the Germans aimed to sabotage faith in leadership, in comrades, in the unseen chain of command that bound men together across oceans and continents. The selection of Mitchell, Whitmore, and Brennan was brilliant in its cruelty. They were known men, respected, visible, surrounded by colleagues who had admired them for years. Accusing obscure figures would cause no ripple. But casting doubt on pillars of reliability, now that would echo through every corridor of command. The whisper that a general might be a traitor does more harm than any lost battle plan. It breeds hesitation. It makes men second-guess every decision, every signature, every handshake. And in war, hesitation kills momentum faster than bullets ever could. The surveillance placed on the three officers remained invisible but suffocating. Clerks were reassigned, letters quietly opened, their correspondence logged by unseen hands. They were never confronted, never questioned. The War Department wanted certainty before taking any step that might expose the truth or the deception. Meanwhile, inside their own offices, each man began to feel a subtle change. Mitchell's aides read distant. Whitmore noticed that his routine reports took longer to process. Brennan received curt replies from London, where once there had been warmth. They could not have known the cause, yet each sensed an invisible current running against them. Suspicion, once born, moves faster than fact. The German architects of doubt understood this principle perfectly. They had studied it for years. Their reports described it as psychological chain reaction. Once a seed of uncertainty is planted among peers, it grows without further effort. The victims water it themselves, with silence, with defensiveness, with fear. It was the same method used by propaganda units across Europe, turning half-truths into full divisions. And yet in this unseen campaign, the true target was not Mitchell, Whitmore, or Brennan.
It was something much larger: the unity of the Allied command. The Germans knew that the strength of America's war effort lay not only in its factories or its fleets, but in the trust linking officers across nations. Break that, and even the most powerful army begins to fracture from within.
By late autumn of 1943, the trap was set. The dossiers, the photographs, the coded notes, all had begun to take root in the right minds. Analysts debated in whispers. Intelligence officers worked late behind locked doors. Files were marked under review and stored in drawers that required 3 signatures to open. The deception had entered its second phase, spreading unseen through the veins of bureaucracy. And for the men at its center, the real nightmare had only just begun.
Winter 1943. The war in Europe grinds forward, but in Washington, another front is opened, one no newspaper would ever report. Inside a windowless office in the War Department's Intelligence Division, investigators gather around a table covered in files, maps, and photographs. The dossier accusing Mitchell, Whitmore, and Brennan has grown thicker. What began as a handful of documents has expanded into a mountain of evidence, each new piece fitting too neatly into the puzzle. The weight of it is undeniable, and yet the more they study it, the more something feels off. First comes a diary, supposedly belonging to General Mitchell. It's discovered through a confidential channel in London, sent by a source claiming to have found it among seized German archives. The handwriting matches perfectly. The diary contains short entries, coded notations, initials, and references to deliveries, contacts, and the corridor. To an analyst's eye, it looks incriminating. To Mitchell's defenders, it's absurd. The general has no reason to keep such a record, but to a system hungry for proof, it feels like confirmation. Experts test the ink, the paper, the cover binding. Everything matches American manufacture from 2 years earlier. Nothing in it gives away the deception.
Next comes a series of intercepted transmissions. They are traced to the European theater, their timing matching several of Colonel Whitmore's official communication sessions. Each coded message refers to cargo movements and adjusted timetables, phrases that could easily describe Allied operations. The patterns align too well. Military intelligence begins to suspect that the leak they feared has been active for months. The transmissions seem to follow Whitmore's travel schedule. On paper, the case is tightening. Then comes the most damning claim of all: testimony. A group of European refugees recently arrived in Switzerland report that they witnessed Lieutenant Colonel Brennan meeting with German contacts in Zurich. Their descriptions are consistent: a tall, lean officer, American accent, military mannerisms. They even recall a distinctive scar on his jawline, a feature Brennan indeed bears. The reports reach Washington through diplomatic channels. To the investigators, it's the final layer of credibility. 3 separate streams of evidence, written, technical, and human, all pointing toward guilt.
The documents undergo full authentication. Handwriting analysts confirm matches to Mitchell's known samples. Cipher experts verify that the intercepted frequencies are genuine and consistent with Allied use. The refugees' statements are cross-referenced and found coherent. To anyone outside the small circle of skeptics, the case is airtight. But beneath the surface, quiet unease begins to spread. None of this should be possible. These men have no history of misconduct, no unexplained absences, no missing records. How could 3 respected officers suddenly appear entangled in a coordinated betrayal?
The analysts tasked with reviewing the case begin to notice peculiarities. The diary, though convincing, contains small anachronisms, a turn of phrase that Mitchell never used, a reference to an office he didn't occupy until months after the supposed entries. The intercepted signals, though technically consistent, are strangely precise. Real transmissions are messy,
filled with minor errors, delays, or variations. These are flawless, almost mathematical. And the witness reports, though identical, are too identical. Each uses the same descriptive phrasing, as though memorized. The pattern is unnerving. Yet when evidence appears perfect, few dare question it. Inside the intelligence division, arguments erupt behind closed doors. Some insist the investigation must proceed to formal charges. Others, aware of how propaganda operates, caution restraint. They remember the Abwehr's track record, its long campaigns of deception across Europe. In North Africa, German intelligence had already succeeded in feeding false data to Allied command. Could this be another such operation? No one can say for certain. The safest path, the generals agree, is silence. Keep the suspects close. Observe, but do not confront.
Meanwhile, the three officers continue their duties, unaware of how their lives are being dissected in secret rooms. Every step they take, every document they sign, every order they issue, recorded, analyzed, interpreted. If they appear calm, it's noted as cunning. If they appear anxious, it's noted as guilt. There is no right move. The walls around them are invisible, but closing in. Mitchell's habit of late-night office hours becomes unusual behavior. Whitnor's quiet personality becomes evasiveness. Brennan's insistence on secure communication lines becomes overcompensation. The more they act with integrity, the more suspicion grows. In a war built on deception, honesty itself becomes a liability. Back in Berlin, the creators of Operation Zweifel watched their plan unfold with precision. The Abwehr Psychological Division, working under the umbrella of the Propaganda Ministry, monitors Allied responses through diplomatic leaks and intercepted chatter. They note with satisfaction that the Americans have not dismissed the accusations. They know that silence means doubt, and doubt, once seeded, does not need tending. It grows on its own. The unit's internal memo, later recovered after the war, describes the strategy in chilling terms. We must create a system in which every man believes another may betray him. A structure divided by suspicion collapses by its own weight. By January 1944, the investigation has consumed dozens of analysts, linguists, and field agents. New reports continue to appear. Letters, meeting logs, even a supposed photograph of Brennan outside a Swiss cafe. Each addition strengthens the illusion. To the trained eye, the work is extraordinary. These forgeries are not crude. They bear the microscopic imperfections of authenticity. Realistic ink aging, genuine paper textures, even correctly layered typewriter imprints. Whoever designed them understood Allied verification methods intimately. That, in itself, becomes a clue. Yet one thought begins to circulate quietly among the senior investigators. What if the enemy has studied us better than we studied them? The sophistication of the evidence suggests long-term preparation. This operation wasn't improvised, it was engineered. Someone within the German intelligence structure knew exactly how American counterintelligence evaluated authenticity, how analysts tested paper fibers, how they verified typeface spacing, how they examined ink oxidation. It's as if the forgers had been reading the rule book of their opponents for years. And perhaps they had. The evidence keeps arriving, unstoppable and deliberate. The psychological toll mounts. Men begin to whisper that maybe the accusations are true after all. After all, how could so much proof exist otherwise? Within a few short weeks, 3 decorated officers who once represented the strength of American command have become symbols of its fragility. The Germans don't need to destroy them physically. They only need to let their own system do it for them. By the end of winter, the case file is a thick binder of deception, pages upon pages of lies dressed in truth. For the first time since the war began, American intelligence finds itself questioning its own reflection. The enemy had found a weapon more devastating than bombs, the ability to make truth indistinguishable from falsehood. And the worst part? The operation was still unfolding. The enemy hadn't finished yet.
They had only just proven that the American war machine could be made to doubt itself.
By early 1944, the case against Mitchell, Whitmore, and Brennan had reached a breaking point. The evidence looked flawless. The reports were consistent. The witnesses believable. But deep inside the War Department, unease refused to fade. Every pattern was too neat. Every connection too precise. Real intelligence work was never this clean. Behind every genuine case there were contradictions, errors, and the messy fingerprints of human behavior. Here, there were none. It was as if someone had built the story in reverse, starting with guilt and designing proof to fit it perfectly. To confront this growing uncertainty, the Army assigned a new man to the case, Colonel Vincent Hayes. A quiet, methodical officer known for his patience and precision, Hayes had spent much of his career untangling enemy deception operations in North Africa. He had no stake in the earlier findings. He did not know the accused personally. His only loyalty was to the truth, wherever it led. When handed the file, Hayes read it once, then again, then a third time. When he finally looked up from the papers, he said only one thing: "It's too perfect."
From that moment, the investigation shifted. Hayes began working backward, deconstructing each piece of evidence to its origin. The diary came first. It was the most personal and therefore the most dangerous. He sent it to the forensic laboratory for a complete chemical analysis, not of handwriting, but of the ink itself. Days later, the results came back. The ink composition did not match American manufacturing standards. The chemical signature pointed to a European source, specifically an ink produced in Germany and distributed across the continent. It was a detail so obscure that few would ever notice, but for Hayes, it was the first crack in the illusion. He then turned to the radio transmissions that had supposedly matched Whitmore's communication schedule. Working with signal analysts, Hayes mapped the origin of each intercepted message. The trail was strange. The source moved constantly, never stationary for more than a few days, following the shifting line of Allied advances through Italy. It was almost as if the sender was deliberately staying just out of reach, always close enough to seem plausible, but never close enough to be caught. That, Hayes realized, was the behavior of an intelligence operation designed to mimic authenticity, not to actually transmit secrets.
The refugee testimonies were next. Hayes arranged for re-interviews through Allied channels in Switzerland. The witnesses, when contacted, grew hesitant. The recollections became inconsistent. One admitted to receiving a payment from an unidentified diplomat. Another could not explain how he recognized Brennan's insignia from across a crowded cafe when he had never served in the military. Under gentle pressure, their stories began to fracture. What had once seemed like clarity dissolved into uncertainty. Piece by piece, the foundation of the case began to crumble. Yet the sophistication of the deception was undeniable. Whoever engineered it understood American intelligence as well as its own. The documents followed the right formats. The transmission codes were mathematically correct. Even the timing of reports mirrored Allied operational cycles. This was not random misinformation. It was a masterclass in psychological precision.
Hayes began to suspect that what he was seeing wasn't simply a smear. It was a full-scale operation, a coordinated attempt to infiltrate Allied decision-making with doubt. He compiled his findings into a confidential report. At its heart was a simple observation. Every piece of evidence aligns too perfectly with the vulnerabilities of the accused. That alignment is not coincidence, it is design. The theory was bold and dangerous. If Hayes was wrong, he would be defending possible traitors during wartime. But if he was right, the implications were staggering. It would mean that German intelligence had successfully weaponized trust itself. As he dug deeper, the trail led him across continents. In London, a captured cache of German intelligence documents referenced an ongoing psychological campaign targeting Allied command structures. The name of the operation was redacted, but the description matched everything unfolding in Washington. Planting fabricated documents, forging credible witnesses, exploiting known personal histories. It was a blueprint for what was happening.
Hayes worked without rest. Each discovery led to another layer of deception. His small team of analysts began identifying patterns, forged documents routed through neutral countries, intercepted communications with convenient timing, refugee testimonies that always appeared when official suspicions started to fade. It was a cycle, a rhythm, designed to keep the investigation alive just long enough to destroy confidence. The pressure on Hayes was immense. Every hour he delayed formal charges increased the risk that a real leak, if one existed, could continue unnoticed. Yet every step he took toward confirmation made him more certain that the danger lay elsewhere. The true enemy was not within the ranks, but beyond them, an invisible network manipulating perception itself. At night, Hayes reviewed his notes alone. The office lights burned late, the corridor silent except for the hum of distant machinery. He could feel the weight of the war pressing through every page. If he cleared the officers and was wrong, the cost would be measured in lives. If he accused them and was wrong, the cost would be measured in trust.
Then came the breakthrough. One of the analysts under Hayes, reviewing paper suppliers, discovered a minor anomaly. The stationery used for the diary had a watermark unique to a batch distributed in northern France, specifically near a facility known to have been under German control. That discovery connected the forgery to a geographic origin. The illusion of an American-made diary fell apart. For the first time, the evidence pointed back toward its true creator. Still, Hayes knew they were only scratching the surface. The operation was larger than 3 officers. It was systemic. It was built to create self-sustaining suspicion, to turn allies into observers and confidence into caution. As long as it worked, the enemy would never need to fire a shot. By the spring of 1944, Hayes had transformed the case from an investigation into betrayal into a study of deception itself. He was close to the truth, but he also understood its danger. The longer the illusion lasted, the deeper its damage ran. Somewhere far from Washington, in offices where the air smelled of smoke and ink, the architects of this deception were watching. They knew the Americans were closing in, but that was part of their design, because in psychological warfare, even exposure can serve the purpose. Doubt, once created, does not need to survive. It only needs to leave a scar.
Far from Washington's marble corridors, another kind of war room existed, one without uniforms or banners. Hidden beneath the upper floors of a government building in Berlin, a small group of men and women worked in silence, their weapons not rifles or tanks, but pens, typewriters, and photographic chemicals. This was no ordinary intelligence office. It was the psychological warfare branch of the German High Command, an elite network formed from fragments of the Abwehr, the propaganda ministry, and academic institutions that once studied persuasion, language, and mass psychology. Their mission was simple in concept, but devastating in execution: to make the enemy doubt itself. By 1943, the German military machine was under pressure. The defeats in North Africa and Stalingrad had exposed its limits. The Reich's armies still held vast territories, but momentum had shifted. In desperation, Berlin turned inward, away from the battlefield and toward the mind. Adolf Hitler's propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, had long argued that perception could decide wars faster than artillery. "Control the story," he once said, "and you control the outcome." The operation that would come to be known as Zweifel, the German word for doubt, was born from this belief.
The architects of Zweifel were not soldiers. They were linguists, forgers, and behavioral analysts. They studied Allied structures the way a surgeon studies anatomy. Their methods were cold, scientific, precise. They built detailed psychological profiles of American officers using intercepted mail
academic publications, and even pre-war conference records. They cataloged friendships, habits, political views, and travel histories. From these fragments, they built potential targets, individuals whose lives contained small, harmless details that could be twisted into signs of betrayal. Mitchell, Whitmore, and Brennan had appeared in those profiles years earlier. Mitchell's logistics papers had once been quoted in a German trade journal. Whitmore's name appeared in correspondence with a French intelligence contact before the occupation. Brennan's attendance at a Berlin technology symposium was public record. All innocent connections, but to trained propagandists, they were opportunities. "We do not create guilt," one German analyst reportedly wrote in his field notes. "We simply reveal what could be guilt." The operation's structure reflected its purpose. One section handled document forgery. These specialists replicated Allied stationery, watermarks, and signatures with unnerving accuracy. Another group focused on signals intelligence, producing fake radio transmissions that matched Allied encryption patterns. The third group, perhaps the most insidious, managed human evidence. They built deep cover identities for agents posing as refugees, diplomats, or neutral observers. Each layer of the operation was designed to support the others, creating a closed loop of validation. If a document raised suspicion, a witness would confirm it. If a signal seemed suspicious, a report would contextualize it. Every lie was reinforced by another lie until truth itself lost meaning. They called their method Selbstverstärkung, self-reinforcement. In psychological terms, it meant a system that feeds its own credibility. The idea came from an academic paper written years before the war, arguing that the most dangerous falsehood is one that explains itself. Goebbels approved the project personally. He saw in it a chance to strike at America's growing confidence. Germany could no longer stop American factories from producing tanks, but it could make American generals question who was driving them.
The first test of Zweifel was conducted in occupied Europe. German agents circulated forged British field orders that appeared to reveal an Allied invasion through Norway. The deception worked briefly, diverting resources and attention. Encouraged by this success, Berlin authorized a more ambitious target: the American command structure itself. The chosen victims were to be figures whose downfall would echo beyond their own departments. Officers respected by peers, men with spotless records. Mitchell, Whitmore, and Brennan fit every criterion. The unit's chief analyst, a former university professor named Dieter Schulte, oversaw the psychological design. He believed that suspicion was more powerful than exposure. "A spy caught," he wrote in a classified report, "is a closed case. A spy suspected is an open wound." The goal was not conviction, it was corrosion, slow, quiet, irreversible. Under Schulte's supervision, the team spent months crafting the dossier that would eventually arrive in Washington. Every page was tested for plausibility. They'd even simulated aging by storing the papers in a humid chamber to mimic wear. The radio transmissions were broadcast from a mobile unit disguised as a civilian weather van. The refugee witnesses were carefully trained, given new names, and sent to neutral territories to await contact. It was not the work of improvisation, but of patience.
By the time Zweifel went into motion, it was only one of many similar efforts operating across Europe. German intelligence had launched dozens of disinformation campaigns designed to fracture Allied unity. Some targeted political relationships, others military confidence. But Zweifel was unique. It attacked the invisible structure that held every army together: trust. The plan succeeded beyond expectation. Reports from neutral diplomats soon confirmed that the Americans had received the forged documents. Schulte's team celebrated quietly. There was no cheering, no boasting, just a silent recognition that they had accomplished something extraordinary. They had made the enemy turn its gaze inward. Yet,
Even as the Germans congratulated themselves, they underestimated the Americans' capacity for adaptation. Psychological warfare, like any weapon, cut both ways. What Berlin had built as an invisible trap would soon become the blueprint for its own unraveling. By the spring of 1944, Washington was no longer the same city for Major General Raymond Mitchell, Colonel Frank Whitmore, and Lieutenant Colonel George Brennan. Their uniforms still carried rank, their offices still bore authority, but something invisible had shifted around them. Conversations stopped when they entered a room. Letters were delayed. Meetings were rescheduled. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but to men trained to read details, the change was undeniable. The air itself seems to hum with quiet mistrust. They were not officially accused of anything. No one confronted them, yet they could feel the invisible net tightening. Surveillance followed them everywhere. An extra car behind Mitchell's on his drive home, new clerks assigned to Whitmore's intelligence unit, unfamiliar technicians checking Brennan's communication lines. The War Department had ordered complete discretion, but in secrecy there is no true silence. Whispers always find a way to travel. Mitchell, once confident and composed, began to crumble under the unseen weight. He stopped sleeping through the night. Each morning he arrived at his desk before dawn, as though proving his loyalty through exhaustion. He reviewed supply manifests, recalculated schedules, anything to drown out the thought that somewhere, someone believed he was the enemy. He told himself it was just wartime tension, but the glances from subordinates, polite, careful, distant, told him otherwise. Whitmore's reaction was different. Methodical by nature, he began documenting every word he said, every message he transmitted, every visitor who entered his office. He built a personal archive, hoping it might one day prove his innocence. His staff found him detached, always writing, rarely speaking. He had once been known for calm humor during long intelligence meetings. Now his silence made others uneasy. Even his allies began to wonder if the rumors were true. Doubt, once released, does not stay contained. Brennan's response was quieter still. The man who had once been the voice of communication now avoided it. He spent long hours alone, testing equipment, adjusting frequency relays that needed no adjustment. He spoke little to colleagues, retreating into mechanical precision. For him, words had become dangerous things. Every sentence could be twisted, every statement misunderstood. In the very networks he had built for connection, he now felt completely isolated.
The German architects of Operation Zweifel could not have designed a more efficient form of sabotage. It was psychological warfare in its purest form. There were no explosions, no arrests, no visible confrontation, only pressure. The accused officers continued performing their duties flawlessly, yet inside, they were unraveling. The true brilliance of the operation lay in its invisibility. The men were being crushed not by their enemies, but by their own consciences, by the unbearable weight of proving a negative, of trying to demonstrate loyalty in a system that no longer trusted them. Inside the War Department, the case still lingered in limbo. Colonel Hayes's investigation was making progress, but the results were classified, known only to a handful of officials. For everyone else, the silence spoke louder than any verdict. The absence of public clearance was interpreted as guilt. Colleagues avoided even casual association, fearing the stain of suspicion might spread. Social invitations vanished. Old friendships dissolved. Mitchell's wife stopped receiving calls from other officers' families. Whitmore's letters to friends overseas went unanswered. Brennan's neighbors no longer greeted him when he returned home late at night. The isolation was complete.
The psychological toll began to show. Mitchell, once decisive, became hesitant. He double-checked every signature, every order, terrified of a mistake that might look intentional. Whitmore's obsession with documentation turned into paranoia. He started keeping his notes in a locked box, convinced that someone was trying to alter them. Brennan, exhausted by silence, began requesting reassignment to field duty, anywhere he could escape the scrutiny. The irony was cruel. The men accused of betrayal were still serving loyally, their lives consumed by the very system meant to protect them. From Berlin's perspective, the operation was exceeding expectations. Reports from neutral intermediaries confirmed that the Americans had taken the bait. The propaganda unit noted that the officers remained active but socially isolated, a perfect outcome. The internal memo described it as Phase 3, psychological disruption. The longer suspicion persisted without resolution, the more permanent its damage would become. Even if the men were later cleared, the scars would remain. Trust, once cracked, never heals the same way again.
Hayes saw that damage up close. In weekly progress meetings, he observed the subtle changes in the officers' demeanor. Their posture, their tone, their eyes, all spoke of men fighting unseen battles. Hayes understood the danger. The German plan wasn't about conviction, it was about corrosion. The accusation itself was the weapon. The longer it remained unresolved, the more destructive it became. Still, the investigation had to proceed cautiously. One misstep could alert the Germans that their deception was being uncovered. Hayes's team continued collecting evidence, now focusing on tracing the origins of each forged document. They needed proof, something undeniable that could clear the men without revealing to the enemy that their game had been exposed. The stakes were enormous. If the Germans realized they were being investigated, they might shift tactics, launching new deceptions elsewhere.
For the accused, every day felt like a test they could not pass. Mitchell began volunteering for additional inspections of his units, desperate to demonstrate transparency. Whitmore requested lie detection examinations. None existed in any reliable form, but the gesture revealed his desperation. Brennan withdrew from his colleagues completely, eating alone in the officers' mess. What none of them could know was that their torment was serving its purpose. The propaganda war was not about facts, it was about perception. And perception was breaking them apart. By late spring, the tension reached its peak. The officers were still at their posts, but they no longer trusted the system they served. They moved through their days like men walking across thin ice, afraid to breathe too loudly. What Zweifel had accomplished was something no weapon could achieve. It made honorable men doubt their own reflection. In war, victory is often measured in territory or battles won, but for these three men, the battlefield was internal. They were fighting to keep their integrity intact against an enemy they could not see. Even if they survived the investigation, they would never be the same. Because once a man has seen how fragile trust can be, he never looks at loyalty in quite the same way again.
By the early summer of 1944, the investigation that had once seemed endless began to shift. Colonel Vincent Hayes, surrounded by walls of documents, graphs, and coded maps, knew he was close to something, but he didn't yet know what. The mountain of evidence built against Mitchell, Whitmore, and Brennan still stood firm on paper, but instinct told him it was hollow. The deeper he dug, the more he saw signs of manipulation. The handwriting matched too perfectly. The witness reports were too consistent. Even the radio transmissions, supposedly intercepted at random, appeared almost choreographed. Nothing in real intelligence ever fit together so seamlessly. Real data is messy. Lies, when carefully made, are not. It began with a name. A man listed as a witness in the Swiss reports, one of those who had allegedly seen Lieutenant Colonel Brennan meeting with German officers in Zurich. His background, according to documents, showed he was a French refugee who had fled through Spain and arrived in Switzerland in 1942. He had no surviving family, no record of military service, no political ties. He was, on paper, the perfect civilian observer. Yet something in his file caught Hayes's eye. The handwriting on his signed statement bore the same style as a letter attached to an unrelated intelligence report from North Africa, a report written by a known German operative under a false identity.
Hayes ordered a cross-reference. Within days, it confirmed his suspicion. The refugee witness was, in fact, a long-term German agent operating under a fabricated identity. He had been inserted into neutral territory years earlier, likely for a future operation exactly like this. The moment Hayes read the verification, the air in his office changed. He realized he was holding the thread that could unravel everything. Once the discovery was made, his team moved quickly. If one witness was fake, how many others were? A full background review began, tracing every supposed civilian who had contributed to the case. Within a week, 3 more identities began to collapse under scrutiny. One woman, listed as an associate translator in Geneva, was found to have never existed in any Swiss registry. Another claimed to have escaped a concentration camp, yet no camp by that name had ever existed. A third had used a passport from a neutral nation that turned out to be forged.
Each revelation widened the crack in the illusion. Hayes began to see the structure of the operation as a whole. Every layer of the deception was built to feed the next. Documents validated by transmissions. Transmissions supported by witnesses. Witnesses anchored by falsified history. It was a masterpiece of construction. But now, at last, the pattern was visible. The turning point came when the analysts began tracing the paper trail of the forged diary. Using industrial supplier codes, they followed its origins across Europe. One manufacturer in Switzerland had recently been investigated for black market trade with German-occupied factories. From there, a shipment of identical paper was discovered in North Africa after a German outpost was captured during the Tunisian campaign. Inside that outpost, Allied soldiers had recovered boxes of partially completed forgeries, letters, maps, and forms designed to mimic American intelligence documents. Among them, Hayes found a folder labeled with a single word in German, Zweifel. The contents confirmed what had only been guessed at. There were handwritten notes outlining the strategy, lists of potential American officers to target, descriptions of their roles, and psychological profiles built from pre-war archives. Mitchell's name was there. So were Whitmore's and Brennan's. The goal was clear: to create a contagion of mistrust inside the Allied command.
For Hayes, the discovery was more than a breakthrough. It was vindication. For months, he had walked a line between reason and paranoia, doubting every step. Now, finally, he could prove that the enemy had engineered the entire affair. The forged diary, the transmissions, the witnesses, all threads in one vast web designed to ensnare not 3 men, but the Allied mind itself. Still, the battle was not over. To clear the officers publicly would risk alerting the Germans that their operation had been exposed. That would drive the enemy further underground, making their next deception even harder to detect. The War Department decided on a different course: silent vindication. The surveillance would be lifted, the men quietly informed of their clearance, but no announcement made. The Germans must continue believing the illusion was working. Hayes personally oversaw the debriefing of his superiors. The room was silent as he presented his findings: the chemical analysis of the diary ink, the fabricated witnesses, the forged communication chains, the captured documents from North Africa. One by one, the senior officers reviewed the evidence. The silence stretched long, heavy with both relief and shame. When the final paper was laid down, the verdict was clear. The 3 officers were innocent. The enemy had succeeded only in momentarily shaking the foundation, but that, in itself, had been a dangerous success. As the investigation concluded, Hayes took a quiet satisfaction in knowing the truth had prevailed. Yet, even as the files were sealed,
He couldn't ignore the irony. The very structure designed to uncover deception had nearly destroyed its own men. The Germans had understood something fundamental about war in the modern age, that you do not need to corrupt your enemy's forces. You only need to corrupt their certainty. In the days that followed, Mitchell, Whitmore, and Brennan were informed privately of the outcome. No explanations were given, only that the inquiry had been resolved in their favor. Their relief was quiet, subdued. There was no celebration, no restoration of public reputation. The ordeal had left its mark. They returned to duty, but not as the same men. Mitchell's hair had gone gray around the temples. Whitmore's hands trembled when handling reports. Brennan spoke little at all. They had survived the most sophisticated psychological assault of the war. But survival does not erase memory. The discovery of Operation Zweifel sent ripples through Allied intelligence. It was not just the exposure of a plot, it was a revelation about the nature of warfare itself. The Germans had shown that an army could be attacked not through its supply lines or defenses, but through its confidence. It was a lesson that would reshape American counterintelligence for decades to come.
Hayes submitted his final report in late June 1944, just as Allied forces began storming the beaches of Normandy. His words, written in the concluding paragraph, carried a quiet warning. The enemy has learned to weaponize doubt. It is our duty to ensure that the truth, however slow, however fragile, remains stronger than fear. And so, the case that began with a mysterious envelope ended not with arrests or trials, but with understanding. The Germans had lost their hidden war before realizing it, but for those who lived through it, the accused, the investigators, the silent observers, the scars of suspicion would never entirely fade, because once doubt enters a system, it leaves something behind, even after it's gone. The memory of how easily truth can be made to tremble.
The truth about Operation Zweifel might have brought relief to Washington, but to Colonel Vincent Hayes, it was not enough. Exposing a deception was only half of victory. In war, truth that is merely uncovered does not change the balance. It must be used. Hayes understood that the Germans who created the operation still believed it was working. Somewhere in Berlin, their analysts were likely reviewing intercepted chatter, convinced that the Americans were drowning in mistrust. That belief was an opportunity too valuable to waste. Inside a secured intelligence wing of the War Department, Hayes proposed a bold idea: to use Zweifel against its own architects. Rather than announcing the officer's exoneration or closing the investigation, the Americans would continue to play along. They would feed the same channels that had been used to deceive them, but this time with false confirmations. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The Germans would keep believing the operation had succeeded, while American counterintelligence quietly mapped their entire psychological network.
The deception began within days. Reports were crafted that appeared to confirm the continued suspicion of the three officers. Internal memos described them as relocated for observation. Classified communication logs showed that they had been reassigned to administrative duties far from command influence. These documents were deliberately placed where German intelligence could intercept them, through controlled leaks in diplomatic channels, career routes, and coded transmissions known to be monitored. At first, it felt dangerous, feeding lies into the same system that had nearly destroyed them. But Hayes and his team operated with precision. They built a mirror version of Zweifel, one that reflected the enemy's own tactics back at them. The Germans received the bait exactly as intended. Intercepted transmissions soon revealed that Berlin believed the Americans had fully accepted the accusations. They were convinced Mitchell, Whitmore, and Brennan were ruined men, disgraced and removed from influence. The propaganda unit celebrated quietly. They considered Zweifel one of their greatest victories. That illusion gave Hayes the freedom to strike. Using the channels the Germans had already established,
American counterintelligence began sending carefully crafted leaks. These hinted at further divisions within Allied leadership, imaginary investigations, false doubts, even fake rivalries between American and British command. Each false message was designed to lure German analysts into revealing more about their communication network, and they did. Intercepted responses from Berlin provided clues, frequency patterns, signal locations, and language markers that allowed Allied codebreakers to trace the flow of disinformation back to its sources. Within weeks, Hayes's team had identified multiple nodes of German psychological operations spread across Europe. Some were embedded in embassies of neutral countries. Others operated under the cover of humanitarian organizations. For the first time, the Allies could see the structure of the propaganda machine that had been targeting them for years.
But it was a dangerous game. If the Germans realized the truth too soon, the entire counteroffensive would collapse. To maintain authenticity, Hayes continued the illusion of internal suspicion. The 3 cleared officers remained unaware of the operation's second phase. Their temporary isolation became part of the strategy. Even their transfer orders were left standing, so that anyone tracking them would see exactly what Berlin expected: 3 disgraced men fading quietly into obscurity. In Berlin, the reaction was exactly as Hayes predicted. The psychological warfare branch, convinced that their plan had succeeded beyond measure, began expanding their operations. They launched similar campaigns targeting other Allied officers, hoping to replicate their supposed triumph. But this time, the Americans were ready. Every new attempt, every forged document, every coded transmission was intercepted and traced. The hunters had become the hunted.
By the autumn of 1944, Hayes's operation had dismantled most of Zweifel's infrastructure. The Germans, unaware of the trap, continued to pour resources into a web already compromised. Their efforts to plant new fabrications only served to expose more agents. For the Americans, it became not just a defensive success, but a strategic victory. They were learning how to weaponize information as effectively as the enemy. The reports sent back to Washington painted a picture of quiet triumph. Dozens of German psychological operations were identified and neutralized. Allied counterintelligence gained unprecedented insight into the workings of enemy propaganda, the methods, the forgers, the psychological theories behind them, and all of it stemmed from one deception turned inside out. Still, Hayes remained cautious. He knew that the war of information never truly ended. Deception was like smoke. It could vanish from sight, yet linger in the air. His greatest challenge was not just to defeat the enemy's lies, but to ensure his own men never lost sight of the truth.
The counteroffensive remained classified for decades, buried in intelligence archives. Officially, Operation Zweifel ended as a failed German effort. Unofficially, it became one of the most successful American counterintelligence maneuvers of the war, a psychological victory achieved without firing a single shot. And though few would ever know his name, Colonel Vincent Hayes had quietly changed the nature of modern warfare. He had proven that even in a world of deception, patience and clarity could turn the enemy's strongest weapon into their own downfall. But while Washington celebrated its invisible triumph, the men at the heart of the deception, Mitchell, Whitmore, and Brennan, were living a different story. They had been vindicated on paper, yet in their lives nothing felt restored. Because even as the truth was reclaimed, the damage it had done to their trust could not be undone.
When the file was finally closed, the official word was simple. The accusations had been unfounded. No charges, no trials, just silence. For Washington, the matter was over. For the 3 officers at the center of it, it would never be. General Raymond Mitchell returned to his post with quiet dignity. He still wore his uniform with pride, but the spark behind his discipline had dimmed. Every conversation carried a shadow of hesitation. He no longer trusted the smiles of subordinates or the casual handshakes of peers. He had seen how easily faith could turn into fear. When his promotion orders arrived months later, he asked for reassignment to a field command. Somewhere practical, he said. Somewhere far from the rooms where truth could be rewritten. Colonel Frank Whitmore became a different man. The experience left him obsessed with procedure. He spent long nights revising intelligence protocols, tightening verification rules, questioning every chain of custody. His colleagues admired his precision, but whispered that he had lost his ease, his warmth. They didn't understand that he wasn't chasing control, he was chasing safety. Every detail he corrected was a barrier against the kind of betrayal he'd endured.
Lieutenant Colonel George Brennan never adjusted. The stress had hollowed him. He finished his tour quietly and requested early retirement. He told no one his reasons. To his superiors, it was health concerns, but those close to him knew the truth. The silence had taken its toll. He had spent months being watched, doubted, and dissected. Even when cleared, he could never silence the echo of those unseen eyes. They had been proven innocent, yet each man carried the weight of guilt that wasn't his. Because innocence, once questioned, never feels pure again. That was the real brilliance of Operation Zweifel. It didn't need to destroy its targets to succeed. It only needed to make them live under suspicion long enough to break something inside them.
Colonel Hayes understood that better than anyone. He visited Brennan before his retirement, hoping to offer closure. But when he tried to explain how the deception had been uncovered, Brennan simply nodded and said, "It doesn't matter. The damage is done." Hayes never forgot those words. They summarized everything Zweifel had achieved. Even with the operation dismantled, its effects lingered. The officers' families felt the strain. Mitchell's wife avoided social gatherings, tired of the cautious glances. Whitmore's correspondence with friends overseas became formal, almost guarded. Brennan, once surrounded by colleagues, spent his days in quiet isolation. The propaganda unit in Berlin had long since been dismantled, yet its work still lived, in scars no document could record.
Across the intelligence community, Zweifel became a whispered case study. It showed how the enemy could fracture an army without touching its borders. The campaign had been defeated, yes, but not without cost. Hayes's final report noted it clearly. Even disproven lies can leave permanent damage. Once trust is shaken, restoration is never complete. For the three men, that truth became personal. They had served honorably, but the war had changed what honor meant. Their names would never appear in headlines. Their ordeal would remain classified for decades. But within the halls of intelligence, their story became a cautionary legend, a reminder that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with whispers.
And when peace finally came, long after the last battle ended, the real victory did not belong to any army. It belonged to the fragile resilience of those who endured the unseen war. The war that never appeared on maps, but lived inside every mind that had ever wondered, even for a moment, who they could trust.